Hello everyone and welcome back. As we have seen, the initial state of our application is currently an empty object. And we can see that this state is being calculated here in response to this initial store action. This store action is going to call all the reducers once at application startup time, and we are going to produce here an output that is going to be the initial application state. Right now this is an empty object, but we would like typically to fill in something here. For example, we would like to say that the user is currently logged out by setting the isLoggedIn flag to false. Let's see how can we do that. We are going to switch to our application and see how the initial state is being computed. So essentially what happens is that all the reducers are going to be called initially at application startup time to respond to the initial action that we have seen here in the store actions list. To this action here. This action that contains no payload, so it's an empty action, it only has here the type. This action is going to cause all the reducers to be triggered, and that is what is going to create the initial state. So how can we specify an initial value for the authentication state? We know that the initial authentication state is going to be produced here by calling the reducer. We know that the reducer is going to be passed the value undefined. So we are going to be using here the TypeScript default properties feature, and we're going to say that if the state argument is undefined, then in that case we are going to initialize it with the initial state value. This value is going to be a constant that we are going to be defining here. So this constant, initial authentication state, is going to be of type authentication state. And we're going to fill in these properties here. The first property that we're going to fill in is the logged in flag that we're going to set to false. So as far as we know, the user is not initially logged in. The next property that we're going to specify is the user property, which is going to be undefined. This object is then going to be passed in here as the default value of the state parameter, which means that the output of this function, the first time that it gets called, it's going to be the initial authentication state object, because we are going to fall here in the default clause case. Let's now have a look at this in action to see how it all fits together. We are going to switch here to a larger window. Let's refresh here our application and have a look at the initial state. Let's choose here the state tab, and we can see here in the raw tab, for example, that now initial state of our application is no longer an empty object. We are indeed defining here some initial state for the authentication state, and we are setting in here the flag logged in to false. Again, the user property is undefined, so that's not even shown here in this raw printout of the application state. We can see that our application starts with this state, and if we go ahead and switch to the login screen, let's trigger here a valid login. Now we have here the diff view of the change between the previous state and the new state. The logged in flag has been set from false to the new value, which is true, and the user property is now filled in with this new value. If we click here on the state tab, we are going to see here the complete state of the store after the login action has been processed, with the login flag set to true and the user property filled in just like before. But if we now click here on the initial action, we can see that the initial state of the store was no longer an empty object. Instead of an empty object, we can see that we have here an object with an auth property as expected. And with this we have concluded the implementation of our first reducer, and as we have seen, there were a lot of steps involved. Let's see if there is a better way of implementing our reducers and somehow automatically generate some of the boilerplate that we need. We're going to have a look at how can we use NgRx schematics to speed up our NgRx development.